We're doing a review and first impressions of Interview with the Vampire Season 2, Episode 1. What can the damned really say to the damned? Season 1 left us on a huge cliffhanger, discovering that the servant dude is actually the vampire Armand, and Armand is truly Louis' love of his life instead of Lestat. So it's got us with a lot of questions, desiring a lot of answers, and on top of that, I was incredibly excited for this one because we're going to talk about part 2 of Interview with the Vampire, the book, which is a section of the book that has never been adapted to film before, and it's got a lot of badass moments. Once it's distracted, Louis gets his hand on this thing's hair and just bashes its face into the floor until it finally stops. And then while Louis is catching his breath and taking stock of things, Claudia jumps on top of this vampire and takes pieces of its skull and starts scattering it around. Starting with the characters. Daniel. I don't have a lot to say about this guy. He's pretty much the same character he was in season 1. I don't 100% understand his purpose right now. I'm hoping we'll get more of that now that we have 2 vampires working against him. Moving into Armand. So up front, we really don't know a lot about this TV show Armand, and though we're getting like little snippets here and there, both in season 1 and now in season 2, when we know that's who this character is, I do think my perceptions are clouded a little bit from what I know about the book in Armand. Because in the books, Armand has very strong mental and telepathic powers.
Hey buddy, don't worry about it because I compelled you to turn Madeline. I thought you'd want a part in it, so I just gave you that little mental push.
Beyond that, we find out later in the book when Armand is not getting what he wants from Louis that he's been withholding various bits of information and never mentioned it in over 100 years of them traveling the globe because he was afraid it would like upset Louis when he was going through a difficult time. 100 years, my guy? Seriously. No, Armand is like manipulative and secretive and withholds information to try and get desired reactions and responses from Louis to get what he wants. The fact that in the show we've had these little hints that maybe Armand does have these telepathic powers, combined with the fact that he is a 500-year-old vampire, which in the show is considered ancient, where it wouldn't have been in the books, makes me feel like there's a huge power dynamic and more powers to be unearthed with Armand that we don't know about yet. And it makes me very wary of him as a character. But to be entirely fair to Armand and the potential Armand-Louis relationship, it is becoming more clear to me that there's something potentially wrong with Louis, like he's possibly mentally unwell. Maybe he's a danger to himself and others. Armand is legitimately, truly concerned about him and just trying to protect his boyfriend's feelings, sanity, safety. Trying really hard to go with the show and assume that's what's going on here instead of falling victim to like all this knowledge I know about him in the books and like fan theories and what seems like more logical to me. Armand gets like this mini arc within the episode where he starts by being off the record and being kind of snide and catty to Daniel, and the two of them having very antagonistic relationship, and then he comes around to being on the record in the interview and showing this very lovey-dovey united front that doesn't necessarily reflect how Armand and Louis interact. I assume that's going to become more clear when we get to his part in the story. Another thing I found interesting is that Claudia wrote about Armand in the journals, so I'm assuming they've removed more pages from Claudia's journal because it doesn't make any sense that she would have met him sometime when she was away from Louis in New Orleans, and it doesn't really make sense to me in the timeline they've set up or in the book timeline that they'd have met Armand while wandering Transylvania. Moving into Louis, one of the first things Louis says is that Claudia no longer sees him and her as the same kind or as people with much in common. I know I mentioned in my episode 6 and 7 review Louis and Claudia didn't seem very similar in the TV show, but it is odd to me that it's pointed out because whatever relationship Louis and Claudia have, it was strong enough that Claudia wanted to bring Louis with her when she escaped Lestat. It was strong enough that she stuck by his side when he took Lestat back. It was strong enough that he agreed to help her kill Lestat. So there is some kind of core emotional connection and relationship. And not only is this kind of like a strange thing to point out in the show, but as a callback to the book, it feels very shocking shallow because in the book, when Louis realizes Claudia doesn't see him as her kind, he's pretty gutted by it, and it leads to this very bleak realization about who Claudia is and what they really did when they turned such a young child and then like separated her so much from humanity. It is interesting to me that Louis asked to go home because New Orleans can no longer be their home. They had to flee there whether or not they killed Lestat because people were suspicious of them. On top of that, they know Lestat is there and probably alive. So I wonder why he asked that, even if he's incredibly miserable here in Transylvania. An intentional prodding of Claudia in a lot of ways. One very interesting moment is when Louis starts hallucinating Lestat. This is book accurate as Louis does sort of see Lestat everywhere he goes. Feels like Lestat has just left rooms or like he can barely make out Lestat's laughter. Here it works on a different level because he loved Lestat and like really couldn't escape his abuse on his own. There's like all of these interesting little emotions, and then there's this nice little foreshadowing promise where he says he will return and destroy everything for Louis, but only when Louis is happy again, which is more or less exactly how it plays out in the book. So I'll be very curious to see what happens. Louis's interaction with Morgan is supremely different here versus the books. The part I want to focus on though is in the book when they meet Morgan, his wife is already deceased and the villagers want to burn the body and Morgan is begging Louis for help. Louis here becomes oddly defensive of Morgan. He tries to protect Elizabeth and insists that there's no reason to burn her body. Meanwhile, Claudia is pretending to sleep in his arms and sort of whispering to let the village people do whatever. It doesn't even really impact them. Like, why is he endangering them? But if anything, it seems like Claudia telling Louis to quit it just makes him more desperate to protect Morgan. And that's such an extreme difference than what we see in TV show Louis. Morgan's romantic partner, soon-to-be wife, has been bitten. She's very much alive, and the villagers plan to behead her while she is alive in a state of superstitious frenzy to prevent her from becoming a monster. Something Louis knows won't happen to her. And he also knows that she will survive the attack if he intervenes and helps her. But instead of doing any of that or feeling any sort of connection between Morgan and mortality, he just turns around and follows Claudia out the door, thinking that mortals have nothing to do with him and Claudia anymore. And it's really interesting to see Louis take a complete 180 turn from his book counterpart. And I'll be curious to see how they sort of like reconcile this with the rest of the events that happen in the book, because him choosing Morgan over himself and Claudia also sort of signals Louis' break from Claudia and like indicates that their relationship has got to a point of no return where he's picking random mortals over her. Critical fracture moment. And here, where their relationship was even more fractured and more obviously dysfunctional, this is like a critical fusing moment that should bring togetherness and like a recommitment. I feel like they're gonna need some other element where they like burst apart again, or some other element that draws Louis back into mortal affairs and caring about humanity again. The further he drifts like this, the more it seems like him and Claudia should be able to work out and he should be able to become a happy vampire and a vampire life. And I think it's interesting that this version of Louis talks so much about how meeting the European vampire affected Claudia, but he omits any emotional feelings he might have had in this moment, which either means that he is protecting himself or he didn't have feelings. And both are kind of interesting to me based off of how extreme book Louis' reaction was to meeting vampires. Finding this vampire that lacks sentience made Louis really spiral and think that perhaps he and Claudia were the only sentient vampires in the world. Lestat had like a secret mojo that made it happen, and perhaps he killed his only other potential eternal companion. It also like really drove Claudia and he to start like this conversation about experimenting with making others, even though it horrifies Louis. Claudia has met other vampires that Lestat hadn't made, where Louis has only ever seen vampires that Lestat created before. You would have thought this would have more impact, and it just doesn't. And then, as I mentioned, present day Louis is becoming very curious to me because he is having these extreme memory issues. He's having extreme emotional swings. It's making me wonder about vampires and immortality and what all that means. In the books, vampires seem to have perfect recall and seem to have no reason to lie about how events went down, excluding Interview with the Vampire vampire itself, which, you know, the only reason I feel like there are lies or misrememberings there is because Anne Rice needed to retcon some stuff to make the Vampire Chronicles happen. And it seems like they have no issue with memory or like these emotional bouts that we're seeing here in Louis. And we know that vampires in this universe do make it to like 500 or older, but it does have me wondering, in the books, Armand talks about how very few vampires make it to 100. A lot of vampires don't survive the end of their era because they have to keep finding like new tokens or connections or elements. Otherwise they get trapped in like the sameness of immortality and they basically just fade away. And I'm wondering if maybe Louis is showing early signs that he's one of the vampires that can't hack it, potentially at risk for destroying himself. And that would be like a really cool direction for the show. Moving into Claudia, how Louis describes her versus how we see her on screen don't seem to align. He talks about her being a manic tour guide, and I never see any mania about her persona. She's steely, she's cold, she's determined, she's obsessed. All that makes sense, checks out with her character where she is emotionally. Since how Louis is describing Claudia doesn't really line up with what we're seeing, and he's making reference to like a mania, to her not dreaming and that potentially driving her insane, and then oh wait, she was dreaming but it was nightmares and that might even be worse. It does make me wonder if Louis is kind of like poisoning the well and sort of implying that Claudia is falling into some kind of insanity or instability, which makes her unreliable or makes her potentially dangerous for Louis. It's hard to say. It's especially interesting he uses these terms while he's hallucinating Lestat. It is interesting Claudia is so deeply affected by meeting other European vampires. The fact that she can't make more fledglings sort of reflects that Claudia tried to make fledglings and couldn't successfully do it. I could see where she sees a lot of likeness between the two of them. It's the first other female vampire she's met, and it feels like this woman is lonely and looking for companionship the same way Claudia is. And there's this moment where they sort of like reach out for each other, and Claudia's like, we can be companionship for each other. And this woman just gives up and chooses to self-immolate. And that's gotta be awful for Claudia, who's probably been going back and forth with really what her next move might be and where she can go from here. It's also kind of interesting to me that while they're traipsing through the European countryside, they've gone back to Louis being the father and Claudia being the daughter. I do wonder what this regression is about, how they came to decide upon it. She is the one who learned the language. She's the one driving this chase. Talking about hallucination Lestat, which I feel like might end up being flashback Lestat when we get to Paris. I love his long hair so much. He's looking great in these hallucination scenes. I think he walks the line between being a believable rendition of Lestat and also being like a haunting of Louis' memory or mind. I also wouldn't be 100% surprised if we found out this has something to do with like the vampiric bond that Louis brings up in season 1, or if this is just pure hallucination, guilt-driven situation. I'm pretty sure the showrunners have said that he is just 100% a hallucination, but we'll see if there's a surprise twist reveal later. And you know, it's nice they included Morgan, even though he's not at all similar to his book counterpart. This version of Morgan presumably survives, where the book version gets killed and is killed at the vampire's hands. I guess in this version, he survives and is betrayed by the vampires he accused of being something else in the mortal world. I don't know, there's not like great symmetry. I think he really is just an Easter egg existing to exist. So some specific scenes I really liked. The moment the soldiers open the coffin and release the bullets, that was pretty cool. It was a nice little modernization of the scene Morgan describes to Louis in the book of them like looking for a vampire in the graveyard. I think it would have been better if they had stuck to the soldiers opening the graves and beheading these corpses, partially because it makes more sense than bullets. It would have shown them sticking to an older tradition, but also it would have been really cool foreshadowing. Claudia isn't present when Louis Lewis actually talks to Morgan in the TV show, which is not book accurate and would never in a million years have happened. Like, Claudia is so obsessed, both in the book and in the TV show, with finding information. I find it very hard to believe she walked away when the adults were talking. However, I do love this opens us up to Claudia talking to the kids and getting like a creepy little nursery rhyme sing-song thing, and her wandering off on her own and discovering vampires by herself for the first time. Much like when she wandered away from Lewis and Lestat in season 1, she did discover vampires on her own, and they're equally brutal, if not having that human element that can turn it into maliciousness. I will say her meeting this European vampire was not as horrific or tense as when Louis and Claudia first meet a European vampire in the books. It does suck some of that like original horror moment from it. When the two of them do finally see this vampire again the second time, a little bit of that horror returns, but I think it gets substituted in for an action moment, which I don't hate. I enjoy it, but I'm not getting the same like fear, tense, and ennui moments that I would have gotten in the book. The fact that we have a female vampire who made this monstrosity and is like mourning his loss and is able to talk and give them information, huge departure from the book. They never find anything like this in Eastern Europe. I'm wondering what that means about this vampire world as a whole. Going along with that, the fact that when they do talk to her, Louis says it's the blood here gone bad that has made them unable to make fledglings and makes them sad and cold and all this other stuff. This is a whole mythological element that doesn't exist in the Vampire Chronicles. I don't know how I feel about its inclusion. I'm wondering if it's just another way to drive the plotline of Claudia wanting to make another vampire and wanting to experiment with creating a fledgling and needing Louis' help with it. So some themes that it looks like this episode and the rest of the season might tackle. Memory is a monster. We forget. It doesn't. So Daniel actually said this in the first season, and we're getting a little flashback of it here at the top of episode 1. And I really dismissed it as just kind of like a cool one-off line that applies to humans. But the fact that it's coming back here, Louis making such a big deal about remembering things and misremembering things, makes me think it is going to come into play. And it might be more about the storyteller than the memory, but we'll see how that balances out. And then for vampires, I think one of the ongoing questions is going to be, who am I supposed to love? Which again is spoken at the top of the episode by Claudia. But I think we can see that both Louis and Claudia are suffering in significant isolation and loneliness. The one vampire who's able to speak to them also suffering in so much loneliness that she decides to kill herself. I bet when we meet Armand, we're going to find out he's super lonely. Even Lestat, like in season 1, when he made Louis, it was to become his immortal companion, which implies Lestat was lonely. I think finding a companion, finding someone to love, and the timing of all of that between Louis and Claudia is going to be key. And then lastly, at the top of the episode, when recapping season 1, they have the moment where Lestat yells to Louis, "This is not a life." And Louis claps back, "That's because you took my life." And I think the tension here between being immortal versus immortal, desiring companionship and desiring this comfort versus like living and what that really means, is going to become more and more intense as we travel into the vampiric world. Like, I do think part of Louis could never get over the fact that Lestat killed him, and he held some kind of resentment towards him that was sort of holding him back, or like him trying to hold on to all these pieces of his life that he sees around him that he's not really part of anymore. And I feel like Louis and Claudia could do this same dance. In fact, Louis is already sort of stepping into it, where he's complaining about the Transylvania journey and sort of asking to go someplace else. He's more or less saying to Claudia, "This is not a life. I don't want to live this way and continue traveling this way." Right? And Claudia doesn't say anything to him in the moment, but in the journal, she basically says that he took her life and took all of her options, and the only thing left for her is seeking this knowledge and knowing more, and then being able to make more decisions from that. And based off of what I know of the books, what I'm seeing in the show, I do feel like this is another element of tension and questioning we're probably going to see in the rest of season 2. So that's all I've got to say about this first episode in season 2. I think it was really fun. There were a lot of great dramatic dramatic effects. There were some great twists and turns, stuff I definitely didn't see coming, and had lots to chew on going into episode 2. If any of you guys wanted a quick catch up on part 3 and what happened in Paris, I do have a Nevermore Knows everything that happened in episode 3 that you can go ahead and check out here ahead of watching the season. I would love to hear your thoughts. Are you watching season 2? What did you think of this opening episode? Let me know in those comments down below. And as always, keep reading.